So we have another major story that the mainstream media has completely dropped the ball on. This one is from USA Today. The title is, quote, Hurricane Maria killed more than 4,600 people, more than 70 times the official death toll of 64, study says. Okay, so quick backstory for those of you who might not have followed the story too closely. In late September, Hurricane Maria, one of the strongest hurricanes in recorded history, hit the island of Puerto Rico. And this was after Irma already came through and did some damage to the island. But Hurricane Maria, like I mentioned, one of the strongest in recorded history, and it was a direct hit on the island. I think when it made landfall, it was probably like a Category 4 or something like that. It was a Category 5 right up until the point where it was about to make landfall on the island. So the government in Puerto Rico was completely unprepared to handle a disaster of this magnitude. The same goes for the federal government and FEMA, whose entire job is supposed to be dedicated to be preparing and providing assistance in disasters like this. The response was it was a fucking debacle. FEMA couldn't get supplies to people who needed it. Communications were down throughout the entire island, from city to city and the smaller towns. There was basically no communication for weeks. And I'm talking about, I'm not just talking about like regular people being able to call their family on the other side of the island, which is important too. But I mean, the local governments had no way of getting in contact with like the neighboring town for weeks because the communications were down and the roads were blocked. So again, it was a disaster. People couldn't get medical supplies, couldn't get clean water, couldn't get food. It was bad. A lot of these deaths were avoidable if the Puerto Rican government and FEMA and other areas of the federal government had taken the necessary precautions and made a serious plan to respond to a hurricane like this, a disaster like this. A lot of these deaths wouldn't have happened. So let me get into the article now. Hurricane Maria likely killed thousands of people across Puerto Rico last year, more than 70 times the official estimate, a Harvard study released Tuesday says. Authorities in Puerto Rico placed the death toll at 64 after Maria roared through the island September 20th, destroying buildings, knocking out power to virtually the entire U.S. territory of more than 3 million people. Researchers at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, however, surveyed more than 3,000 households on the battered island. By extrapolating those findings, researchers determined that at least 4,645 excess deaths occurred during the storm and the weeks that followed. The researchers said the number was conservative and that the death toll likely exceeded 5,000. Many of the deaths were due in part to power outages that crippled medical and other services. The study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Quote, our results indicate that the official death count of 64 is a substantial underestimate of the true burden of mortality after Hurricane Maria, end quote. The study says. Representative Bernie Thompson, Democrat of Missouri, who serves on the House Committee on Homeland Security, issued a statement calling the Harvard totals, quote, heartbreaking, and described the federal response to the storm as woefully inadequate. Quote, the 2018 hurricane season begins this week, and it is critical that we do not repeat the mistakes of last year, Thompson said. We can and must do better for all Americans. Only one hurricane to hit the U.S. has taken more lives than the study estimates Maria did. The Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900 killed more than 6,000 people. More than 1,800 people died when Hurricane Katrina roared across the U.S. Gulf Coast as a Category 5 hurricane in 2005. More than 1,500 of those deaths were in Louisiana. The Harvard study notes that in Puerto Rico, every disaster-related death must be confirmed by the Institute of Forensic Science. The system counts only bodies that are brought to San Juan or were confirmed by a medical examiner traveling to the local municipalities. The system also fails to capture indirect deaths resulting from worsening of chronic conditions or from delayed medical treatments, the study says. Quote, these difficulties pose substantial challenges for the accurate and timely estimate of official all-cause hurricane-related mortalities, the report says. Maria raked across Puerto Rico as a Category 4 hurricane, the strongest storm to hit the island in 89 years, among the strongest ever to strike the U.S. Maria was one of 3 horrific hurricanes in 2017. Harvey and Irma were the others. All 3 are among the costliest hurricanes in U.S. history, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Maria caused an estimate of $90 billion in damage, making it the 3rd costliest ever in the United States. Hurricane Katrina remains the costliest hurricane on record at $160 billion. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, has approved $1 billion in individual assistance grants for residents of Puerto Rico. More than $500 million has been designated for repairs to bridges, government buildings, and other structures. Now, this was a great study done by Harvard, and it was very detailed, definitely more detailed than any report or study that's been done by the media or local governments or the federal government. So I give credit to the people who were working on this at Harvard. They didn't account for all the deaths that could be related to the hurricane because for several reasons. They were only counting the bodies that were brought to San Juan, or that specific medical examiner from San Juan who was going from municipality to municipality to the different medical examiners to verify those cause of deaths were related to the hurricane. So there were many others that couldn't have been included in the study. They also made clear that they couldn't account for the people who already had chronic conditions like liver disease or heart disease or cancer, whatever, whose conditions were worsened by the lack of medical attention after the hurricane, or the lack of power and the lack of medicine. So there were people who had chronic conditions that were exacerbated by the aftermath of the hurricane that couldn't be directly linked to the hurricane and its death toll in this specific study. So there were possibly hundreds more people in that same time frame that weren't included in the study, and the study was only done from September to December of 2017, so that's 3 months. The hurricane, the aftermath has lasted way longer. There's still parts of the island that haven't recovered, and therefore there are people who might still be dying from the second and third order effects of the hurricane, probably even now or up until a couple months ago. To something that wasn't in the article, that wasn't mentioned in the article, I don't think it was even in the study, the government was actively trying to cover up the real death toll of the hurricane because they knew it was going to make them look bad, because they were unprepared and the response was a fucking disaster. The morgues were overflowing with bodies immediately after the hurricane, and it was hard to find coverage on what was actually happening on the ground in Puerto Rico at the time, for obvious reasons. Like I mentioned, communications were down, and on top of that, the mainstream media was not really paying that much attention to it. So one of the outlets that was really there from the beginning is Democracy Now! And I've mentioned them with Amy Goodman. Like I mentioned in the show before, they do some great work. It's an independent media outlet. They have their own website, democracynow.com. They have a YouTube channel. They have a nationally syndicated radio show that's played across the country, and I think it's played internationally too. And they're on a couple of different TV networks. So they were among the only big outlets that were covering it. At the time, the stories that were coming out of Puerto Rico were horrendous, because they were talking about bodies just laying in the streets. There were bodies floating in the rivers and floating in standing water. There were people dead in their homes, and it was insane. And then when you would see the destruction and the aftermath of the hurricane, there were just homes that were completely destroyed and flat, and people's houses were missing roofs. There were giant holes in people's roofs, and buildings were destroyed. The streets were completely blocked off and filled with debris. And from the initial reporting of what was happening, before any death toll was compiled, or anybody had any idea of an official number, anybody paying attention, and definitely anybody on the ground, knew that this was a disaster, like something we've probably never seen. Because, like I mentioned, all the details of what was happening on the ground and the aftermath, when you see the destruction, I have never seen anything that is even comparable to that, other than in war zones where it's usually the U.S. doing, like in Iraq or in Afghanistan, where we do airstrikes and basically destroy entire cities. And now those are really the only comparable images that I had in my mind when I was looking at the damage. So I already knew it was going to be a disaster. And then at the time, maybe a week or so after the hurricane, there were the government was putting out their death toll, and they were saying that 16 people died on the entire island of Puerto Rico after the hurricane. No, anybody, again, paying attention knew that shit didn't jive, because that number did not match what we were seeing in the reporting that was coming from people on the ground and what they were actually saying. So from right then, we already knew it was bullshit. But like I mentioned, they were actively trying to cover up the real death toll because it would make them look bad. I'll give you some details on how they were doing that. The morgues, they were overflowing with dead bodies. Some of them were, like the article mentioned, people who had chronic diseases, who couldn't get their medical treatment because of the destruction in the aftermath of the hurricane. So they ended up dying. A lot of those people were filling up the morgues. There were people in like traffic accidents or other kind of accidents that were related to the hurricane, but they didn't really and they were in the morgue too, and just all these other deaths that were connected to the hurricane. And the surge that they saw in these morgues, it was clearly related to the hurricane. It wasn't that, oh shit, what do you know, there was a giant hurricane hit the island, and then days later all the morgues are full with dead bodies. But that's not related to the hurricane at all, apparently, according to the government. And they would sign these death certificates and put these other causes of death that weren't related to the hurricane to keep the death toll artificially low, to keep the coverage of the story to a minimum. And so yeah, instead of attributing the surge in these morgues that were clearly full way past capacity and had way more bodies than is normal, they attributed these deaths to other causes that weren't related to the storm. Before any real thorough investigation could be done on what was causing this enormous surge in bodies in these morgues all over the island, before this investigation could be done, they cremated thousands of bodies. The only explanation for those deaths that we have now is just whatever they put on paper, and clearly they weren't telling the truth, because hundreds and hundreds of bodies were filling the morgues right after the hurricane. But they were saying, and like I mentioned before, hundreds of bodies were in the streets and in rivers, and instead of attributing that to the hurricane, for months and months and months, they said the death toll was at 16, and then eventually they moved it up to 64. And then today, they finally acknowledged, okay, maybe the death toll is over 1,000, maybe. So clearly they're lying, and they keep getting caught lying. And the only way that media organizations, and I think this Harvard study, was able to get the records of the deaths at the time was because a judge, they had to sue the Puerto Rican government for the death records, and a judge had to order the Puerto Rican government to release those records. So that's the only way that anybody has any idea of how many people even died at the time and much less the causes of death. So again, this whole time the Puerto Rican government was doing everything they could in their power to stifle an investigation of the actual death toll of Maria, just because it would make them look bad. This was just a complete failure of the Puerto Rican government, as well as the federal government in Puerto Rico. A complete collapse of the government. I'll give you a couple of details on that. It took more than 6 months to restore power to just 80% of the island. 6 months. 6 months after a major hurricane. And there are 3 million people living on this island. Just imagine what it would be like to live without power for 6 months. That's insanity. You think it's hot here? Yeah, it's hot. But imagine in Puerto Rico, on that island, that is even closer to the equator than Florida. It is hot all the fucking time, and they had no power. For months, there were people, elderly people, in nursing homes, and this caused even more deaths because there were people in nursing homes, elderly people, who were on like some of the top floors and they couldn't get down, and they were just sitting there in this sweltering heat with no clean water and no food. So this led to even more deaths, as well as the people who were in hospital, like who have those chronic conditions, people who have like liver disease and they need or kidney disease, whatever it is, and they need dialysis to remove the toxins out of their body. That requires electricity, and if they didn't have access to electricity, they wouldn't be able to get the dialysis treatment, which led to more people dying. People weren't able to recharge their oxygen machines because they did not have access to power. All these different issues that were attributed to people not having power. On top of that, people weren't able to boil water, since basically nobody on the island had access to clean water for a very, very long time. They didn't even have power to boil the water that they did have access to. So a lot of people were drinking tainted water and got sick from it. Yeah, like I mentioned, the water was out, and this caused a whole other set of problems. So because people didn't have access to clean water, they were just roaming the island looking for water anywhere they could find it. And one place that a lot of people ended up, and this was a story on Democracy Now!, a lot of people ended up going to a Superfund site, an EPA Superfund site, where they had these, I don't know if they were hoses with water in them or whatever it is, but these are toxic waste, literally official toxic waste sites that were around the island, and these were the only place where people were able to find water. And they were drinking the water that was tainted with chemicals, all these toxic chemicals and things like that. Chemicals that could give people organ failure and cancer and liver disease and all these different health problems that you could get from being in contact, just being in contact with the chemicals and the water. But people were actually drinking the water because they had no choice. So that was a whole other disaster. Hospitals weren't operational for weeks to months. A lot of them didn't have power. When they did have power, they didn't have medical supplies because they had no way of getting any additional supplies. So they kept running out of what they did have in supply in the hospital. And since the roads were closed and they had no access to help, they couldn't get the supplies that they needed. So medicines, prescriptions, all those things people didn't have access to. I mean, in hospitals, much less their own houses and homes. So that was a whole nother issue. The 911 system was down for weeks. So people couldn't even call 911 because, like I mentioned, the communication towers were down. They were destroyed. On top of that, there was no power. So the 911 system was down for weeks. There were multiple reports of all these different smaller towns and municipalities on the island that didn't even see any help at all after the hurricane until weeks later, sometimes even months later, because the roads were blocked and the communications were down. So they didn't even, some municipalities didn't even have contact with their neighboring towns to see what was going on right next door, much less with with the central government in Puerto Rico and the federal government and FEMA. So they didn't see help for weeks and sometimes even months. So I'm sure that led to even more deaths. This was a complete and utter failure and collapse of the government in Puerto Rico and the federal government. And which brings me to my next point. This story should be, still right now to this day, it should be a major scandal, because we've never seen anything like this ever. This scene was as close as a post-apocalyptic scenario as you can get. The government wasn't working, hospitals weren't working, roads were blocked off, people couldn't get in supplies, people couldn't get water or food. This was as bad as it can get. It was literally the worst humanitarian, it is the worst humanitarian crisis that has ever happened on the United States soil. So this was completely unprecedented. Nobody has ever seen anything like this. Yeah, the hurricane was one of the strongest in recorded history, but the aftermath and the response alone should have been a major scandal and should have got been headline news for weeks and for months, and honestly should be a major topic of discussion till right now, because that is one of the jobs of media, to highlight important stories and to shed light on them, so that they don't go ignored, and so that it's not easy to sweep them under the rug, and so that people actually pay attention and they get the attention that they need so that they can be addressed sooner and effectively. And it was, the media coverage was and still is a joke. Now, after this story came out a couple months ago now. This story came out the same weekend that Roseanne was fired for her racist tweets against Valerie Jarrett on Twitter, where she said she looked like I don't know, a fucking monkey or something like that. That story at the time came out the same time that this study from Harvard came out that said at least minimum 4,600 people died from September to December in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Maria. Came out the same time, but Media Matters did an analysis of the major news outlets like MSNBC and Fox and CNN, and they saw how all these 24-hour news outlets, and they compared how much they covered the Roseanne firing to the Puerto Rico study, and they said that, and they came to the conclusion that in all these, I think it was just MSNBC, CNN, and Fox that they did the analysis on, and combined they covered the Roseanne firing in the initial 24 hours, because it came out the first 24 hours of Roseanne firing and the 24 hours of the study on Puerto Rico, and they came to the conclusion that they spent 10 hours talking about the Roseanne story and how she was fired for a fucking racist tweet, and 30 minutes covering a story that exposed the federal government and the Puerto Rican government for their failures, and that showed minimum 4,600 people died in this hurricane. That coverage is obviously disproportionate. There should have been way more focus on the Puerto Rico story, but yet it only got 30 minutes of coverage on these three major news outlets that are running for 24 hours of the day. They are allegedly covering news stories for 24 hours of the day, but yet they only had 30 minutes for what at the time was the biggest story of the day, and yet they covered the fucking nonsense of Roseanne's firing for 10 hours. 10 hours. That is journalistic malpractice at best. What are you guys doing? What are you doing? Your job is to inform people. This isn't supposed to be fucking Entertainment Today or E! News or any of these other celebrity gossip outlets. Your job is to cover serious stories that are affecting people and affecting people's lives. Serious stories that highlight the failures of our government and you're covering nonsense, and it goes back to all the biases in the media that I've spoken about before, where it's gotten to the point where they would choose to cover anything but policy, anything but a real story, because they just don't want to be bothered with it. They don't think it's sexy enough. They don't think enough people would want to watch a story about a Harvard study that's not as sexy as Roseanne being fired for something racist. Ooh, that is so not shocking, because Roseanne has had a history of saying racist shit. On top of that, ABC knew all of this before they hired her, so the fact that they fired her over it is ridiculous, but that's a whole separate issue. But that's clearly not as important as 4,600 people losing their lives from government incompetence. So again, this is just another major story that the mainstream media dropped the ball on. I don't know why people aren't covering this to this day. It is such a major scandal, but yet here again, only people talking about these kind of issues is independent media, which is why people should be supporting independent media, because we're the only ones who are really going to tell you as it is. We're going to tell you what's happening in the world, the shit that you should know about, and if we left it up to mainstream media, nobody would know shit about shit that's going on in the world.